My friends, by early February it became clear that the Russian offensive against VUHLEDAR had failed. A battle which proved to be very costly for Russia and where Ukraine suffered relatively few casualties. The research for this battle took me much longer than I expected, but
I told you, I'm a man of my word.
A few weeks ago, the internet was flooded with spectacular images of piles of burning Russian tanks, all grouped up in some sort of tank graveyard, marked with always increasing big red numbers. This is the result of this ill-fated Russian attack against VUHLEDAR. Entire Russian armored columns lined up in the open, whose trails are clearly visible in the snow, all but annihilated with a few survivors fleeing from the battlefield. And for having failed to capture VUHLEDAR, the Russian Ministry of Defense promoted Lieutenant General Muradov to the next rank of Colonel General. Yet another humiliating setback for Moscow, very similar to the failed Russian river crossing in Bilohorivka in May 2022. That left over 50 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned. But to claim that the Russian army has not evolved on a tactical level for a year would also be false. And perhaps the images we all saw from VUHLEDAR were misleading and part of some manipulation. Analyzing what really happened at VUHLEDAR was really complicated. On the pro-Ukrainian side, there was a lot of chest beating and denial or complete silence from the Russian side.
Everybody stay calm! What's the procedure, everyone? This is the worst!
So let's cut the BS and take a look at what actually happened. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Remember that if you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, just like with many other commentators, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to all of you that have already helped. And welcome to the headquarters. First things first, VUHLEDAR is located right here, roughly 133 kilometers southwest of Bakhmut, the Russian battle plan. In mid-January, after Wagner successfully stormed Soledar, somewhere deep into the general staff of the Russian Ministry of Defense, a plan was born in order to show a similar victory to the public, that they were also capable of such a feat of arms. And for this mission, they decided to capture the town of VUHLEDAR. Russian intelligence services estimated VUHLEDAR to be defended by only 2 battalions of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. As you can see behind me, the town and the surrounding area is too small to house more than this garrison. However, what makes this position complicated to attack is its numerous high-rise buildings, these commie blocks, that overlook kilometers of flat terrain with barely any cover. The plan to capture VUHLEDAR did not differ much from Wagner's tactics during the assault of Soledar. And just like with Soledar, the operation was meant to be completed in a week. For the main assault, the Russian army concentrated the 40th and 155th Marine Brigades, which would in theory provide them with a 4-to-1 numerical advantage. But they also brought the 72nd and 136th Motorized Rifle Brigades in reserve, as well as the 123rd Rifle Regiment of the DPR, on top of artillery pieces, as well as other recon and Spetsnaz units. Roughly 20,000 men were involved from afar in this operation. Also keep in mind that I did not mention any BTGs. That's because after the Russian mobilization in fall, the Russian command stopped using their famous BTGs and went back to a more traditional structure based on brigades, formations that are beefed up with much more infantrymen. Interestingly enough, it's also the system that Ukraine has been using. Problem is, if the plan was beautiful on paper, this is how it was explained in real life. And 2 weeks later, the entire military operation would turn into a fiasco, with close to 70 armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned. The assault. The attack on VUHLEDAR started on the night of January 24th, 2023. Before launching the assault, the Russian artillery bombarded every square meter of the town. They also used the infamous heavy TOS-1 MR-less flamethrowers against Ukrainian strongholds in the suburbs of VUHLEDAR. On the 26th of January alone, they fired 322 times on VUHLEDAR. And here are the results of Russian artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions. They effectively set the city ablaze. Meanwhile, Marine units regrouped before the assault. Here you can see around 10 BMPs with soldiers on top. Then the 155th Marine Brigade went on the offensive to cover their advance from enemy drones. Every BMP released some sort of smokescreen. First step was to depart from Mikilske and capture the southern Dacha area, some sort of suburban area with many individual houses, which could provide some cover for the attacking infantry, which you can witness in this video from the perspective of Russian Marines on top of a BMP. We can hear artillery and small arms fire in the background, with smoke rising from VUHLEDAR in the distance. Once that was done, they pushed north across the suburbs. In this one, you can see two BMP-3 unload their Marines as they provide suppressive fire with their 30mm and 100mm guns. And if you're into POV, this is how they penetrated Ukrainian lines. We see an armored vehicle, possibly a BMP-3, filled with Russian Marines advancing along a tree line. They're supported by a tank on their right. As the vehicle is approaching the first row of houses, it carries intensive suppressive fire. Eventually, these guys find themselves inside the suburbs and find a place to disembark the Marines, roughly a 10-man squad, that then tries to storm the house by firing at every opening. During this attack, they regularly called for mortar support to pin down enemy defenders. In this video, probably recorded a day or two after the initial assault, we can see another squad that managed to secure a building and regrouped in some basements. Before going back on the assault across the ruins, they managed to capture another house from where they engaged Ukrainian troops with small arms fire. And here you can see a top view of this action. Also notice the absence of BMP-3s, meaning they had to return to the rear to bring the second batch of troops. At this point in time, the Russian Marines had used small group infiltrations, had set up 4 positions really close to VUHLEDAR. Basically, they had accomplished their objective. As you can see here, they even managed to capture some POWs. Russian forces had pushed 2.5 kilometers deep into Ukrainian lines. This is when the Russians were reportedly fighting their way towards this gas station at the northern edge of the Dachas, about 400 meters from VUHLEDAR proper. It took the Marines from the 25th of January to the 27th, 3 days, to mop up the suburban area, from where they could launch part 2 of their offensive. Now, I don't know if it was according to plan or if someone made a mistake, but instead of pushing northeast towards the Yuzhno-Dobaskaya No. 1 coal mine, which would effectively cut off VUHLEDAR, the troops instead turned west and directly attacked VUHLEDAR. In my opinion, the Russian Marines saw an opening and immediately seized the opportunity to storm VUHLEDAR just like Wagner would have done. As proof, some Russian recon units were recorded from inside one of the commie blocks in VUHLEDAR. This move proved to be a bad decision. Ukrainian troops stationed on the rooftops of these commie blocks had a direct line of sight on the Russians, and in front of them hundreds of meters of open terrain. The advancing Russian Marines came under very accurate Ukrainian artillery fire, which stopped their cavalry charge, more importantly, but also stops any supplies and reinforcements from reaching them, like this column that lost 5 out of 6 armored vehicles, with the latest remaining one covering the withdrawal of their surviving crews and infantrymen. Here's a top view of the same ill-fated column. We can see some abandoned BMP-2 and BMP-3s, but interestingly enough, also an IMR-2, a combat engineering vehicle, meant to bring the damaged vehicles back to base for repair. So long story short, lots of Russian infantrymen were now stranded in this area. And this is where the Russian plan just fell apart. The Ukrainians were now on high alert. They managed to pin down the main assault and stop the Russian flanking maneuver west of VUHLEDAR right in its tracks. Back in November, the Russian command neglected to capture the northern part of Pavlivka across the river, which could have been used like a breachhead and a staging ground for the attack on VUHLEDAR. So Ukrainian artillery simply bombarded Russian troops, and they never really made it beyond the river. 2 strikes for the Russians, and now the 3rd strike was when the Russians failed to capture the villages of Zalotaya Niva and Preshistovka, held by the 68th Jaeger Brigade west of VUHLEDAR. The entire maneuver that looked so brilliant on paper had failed. As for Russian losses, it's very hard to say. Some Ukrainian sources claim that the entire 155th Marine Brigade has been destroyed, while other alleged testimonies claim that 300 Marines were KIA per day. But I have to admit, I'm very skeptical of these claims. I think we can divide by 10 those claims and get a somewhat accurate portrayal of the losses during the first 4 days of the offensive. because the entire 155th Marine Brigade was still fighting in VUHLEDAR all of the way through February and early March. And the only valuable information from this Forbes article is that it confirms that during all these days, Ukrainian artillery was still firing at the Russians. First conclusion, although the city of VUHLEDAR looked like hell on camera, we can question the actual effectiveness of the Russian artillery barrage. Perhaps they mainly fired on the city itself and neglected to suppress Ukrainian artillery positions. Without talking about the very lethal Ukrainian counter-battery fire that possibly neutralized a number of Russian howitzers. Another important factor is that the Ukrainians had 3 months to prepare and fortify their positions around VUHLEDAR, which probably included lots of underground tunnels and bunkers, which reduced the lethality of the Russian shells. While the Marines were holding on to the dachas, Ukrainians mustered their reserve units, and on the 28th of January, the Ukrainian army launched a counterattack, which cancelled Russian gains from the past days. It seems the Russian command failed to take into account possible reserve battalions of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, on top of reserve units of the 68th Jaeger Brigade. But truth is, more and more Ukrainian reserve units kept pouring on the Russians, and essentially flipped their numerical advantage around. There are mentions of the 35 Ukrainian Army Brigade of the Navy, as well as 1 battalion of the 80th Airborne Assault Brigade that came all the way from Liman. And in the end, the Ukrainians pushed the Russians back to their starting positions. By January 30th, the Russian Marines regrouped and counterattacked the Ukraine counterattack and retook control of the southern Dacha area. But momentum was lost. Yeah, and this is where it should have stopped. Now you might think, but what about this tank graveyard massacre I saw on Twitter? Well, it's no. 3rd time's the charm. So the Russian command around VUHLEDAR was now in panic mode. The central attack had failed. The western attack had failed. What remains? Bypass the city from the east. On the 29th of January, Russian forces advanced north of Mikhailivsk and took control over heights, which overlooked the coal mine. Why wasn't it done earlier?
Don't know.
Reportedly, it was men from the 155 Marine Brigade that captured these positions. By early February, the goal was now to bring in reserves, break through, swing north, capture the coal mine, and call it a day. Now, the idea was great, but it's actually how you do this idea that's crucial. Now, some Russian commander had the brilliant idea to line up his entire armored column in plain sight. In this frame alone, I can count 14 tanks and BMPs. And you know what happened next? They got into a freaking minefield. Nobody bothered to check before the attack if this path was safe. In this one, you can clearly see how the leading vehicles were hit, with surviving crews at the back. And then instead of just cancelling the attack and withdrawing their own trucks, the other tanks try to bypass them and magic, they also get hit. In this one, you see 4 Russian destroyed vehicles. 1, 2, and 3. 4. Look, I put the numbers on it. I use VAR, it's true. Just kidding, I forgot to press play. Warning, this is exactly how Twitter bots count casualties. They take a still frame, put numbers on it, and call it a day. Anyway, here we see 4 vehicles and infantrymen retreating under cover of this mine-rolling tank. So they did have anti-mine equipment. Now this vehicle, instead of patiently following the tracks of the mine roller, the driver goes to the side and boom, it explodes. And tragically also hits the 2 guys beside. Now the mine rolling tank is gone, but he made a safe path for everyone to withdraw. The tank and this BMP retreat with about 15 guys on foot that try to rescue the crew from the previous destroyed vehicle. Then the tank changes path and gets damaged by a mine, and the crew abandons the damaged tank. Now pause. And you saw it on cam. This goes against what NAFO bots claim that for every destroyed Russian vehicle you have 5 losses. And here's another example. In this video you can see a Russian tank blown up by a mine in the distance. But the entire crew managed to escape, and they're waiting in a shell crater until they get rescued. Which eventually happened, as you can see in this picture, where they got safely to the hospital. Now back to the tank massacre. Once again here 2 tanks are damaged, and the 3rd one trying to bypass them hits an anti-tank mine. Same scenario here. First one gets hit and the second one goes around, boom, minefield. At the end of the day, dozens and dozens of vehicles were left behind, and the surviving crews and infantrymen made their way back to friendly lines. Meanwhile, the drone operators of the 72nd Brigade then hunted down the stragglers left behind by dropping grenades on them. As you can imagine, I had to censor some parts. There's stuff that I can't show you. But video recordings show about 30 Russian vehicles left behind, 13 tanks and 12 BMPs destroyed or abandoned, which people say it's about half of a Russian battalion, half of the equipment of a Russian battalion. In the end, according to this diagram, the Russians left at least 71 pieces of equipment behind by mid-February. On this map right here, you can clearly see where these Russian columns got ambushed. Now, what's important to know is that this event did not take place in VUHLEDAR, but here, 5 kilometers to the east, along these huge rectangular fields, 2 kilometers of open terrain. You can clearly see the tree lines along which they drove, and the fact that the Russian commander spread out his forces created even more chaos. Now, it's important to remember that Ukrainians were entrenched along this tree line. This is the positions that the Russians tried to break through. The Ukrainians had dug trenches along this tree line, like you can see in this video, as well as in this one. Now, the media said, oh, all the losses are on the 155th Marine Brigade. This unit has been destroyed. Not really, because the Russian unit that was ordered to move on for this flanking maneuver was the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade. And it's funny because they were facing the Ukrainian 72nd Mechanized Brigade. But more specifically, this unit that got hammered is actually the Alga Battalion of volunteers from Tatarstan attached to the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade. Here you can see a video of this same battalion from Tatarstan preparing to be sent to Ukraine on the 29th of August, meaning they were already present in the zone of operations for nearly 4 months. So another conclusion of this is that even Russian volunteer battalions are relatively well equipped in armored vehicles, and they're not only used as light infantry or cannon fodder. Now, if you paid attention, you'll remember that I said that the majority of Russian equipment losses were due to mines. But I also said that the Russians had mine rollers. Something doesn't add up. In this video here, you see abandoned the Russian T-80 BV tanks, and one equipped with a KMT-7 mine roller. These mine rollers are actually very effective at neutralizing anti-tank mines. And in this video, you see exactly how they're meant to be used. You have one T-80 BV tank, equipped with a KMT-6 mine roller ahead. The tank is opening a path, and the drivers of the BMP-3s behind have to closely follow the same tracks. And we can also see that the mine rolling tank is OP because it can also engage enemy targets. So as long as they stay in formation, everything should be fine. So in the end, from the information I managed to gather, these Russian recon units that are said to be from the 40th Marine Brigade were sent ahead to open a path for the reserve to come forward, aka the Tatar Battalion, that also had mine rollers just in case. And this is where America comes in. The flanking maneuver at VUHLEDAR failed because of remote anti-armor mines launched by Ukrainian 105mm howitzers on a corridor that had been already cleared of mines. The Ukrainians fired scatterball mines like these ones. And surprise, surprise, on the 4th of October, we learned that the United States is giving Ukraine 1,105mm rounds of remote anti-armor mine systems. So this technology definitely played a role in the outcome of this tank graveyard. But did you also notice the amount of footage that Ukrainians got? That's because they had all their drones flying freely on top of the armored column without interference. That's because someone sent the Tatar volunteers forward, neglecting proper radio-electronic combat cover to jam these drones. Now you have a beautiful armored column of Russian equipment in parade formation with no air cover, no air defense, or electronic warfare escort. Nothing. Another factor is that it was probably the first time in combat of this Tatar battalion. Here's what I think happened. The column advanced, and suddenly, mines started exploding. Since they had been told that the path had been cleared of mines ahead of them, the commander of these vehicles thought it was an artillery barrage. So what do you do when your area is targeted by an artillery barrage? You scatter. This is why the vehicles went in crazy directions left and right. And what happened when they moved away from the safe path? Well, other mines exploded, which increased the chaos, and then it was total panic. The crews abandoned the vehicles and the infantrymen just fled. I think that's a logical explanation of what happened. This allows us to question the actual combat training that many of these newly recruited men of the Russian army effectively got, or what type of briefing they got before going for their combat mission. Now, many Russian military bloggers were wondering what type of punishment should be given to a commander that sends his men like that to slaughter. We know that when a Russian private pushes a lieutenant colonel with his hand, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Meanwhile, what happened to the commander of the Tatar battalion, or the overall commander of the operation in VUHLEDAR? Not only did he not get punished, but he got a promotion. And this is what Prigozhin said about the Battle of VUHLEDAR. How come people who graduated from the best military schools and academies failed to plan the offensive on VUHLEDAR? Meanwhile, in Bakhmut, it's officers who were expelled or dismissed from the army that are successfully doing the planning. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon and PayPal. The links are in the description below.